Another day, another media drive, and this morning I'm joined by the GWM Tank 500, a hybrid flagship SUV by GWM, powered by a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine as well as the fantastic HEV system that we first saw from the Haval H6. We're asking 3 questions today. Is it efficient? Is it comfortable? And does it justify its price? Now, after having driven the Tank 500 from KL all the way to Penang yesterday, spending some 5 hours in the driver's seat, I've gotten to get to know this car a little bit better. But perhaps more importantly, before anything else, while this car certainly looks very brash and very bold, what we first have to touch on is the powertrain, because this is the first electrified body-on-frame SUV in the country. Now, the Tank 500 will compete against vehicles like the Ford Everest as well as the Toyota Fortuner to some extent, although its most natural competitor is the Toyota Land Cruiser. But this car is equipped, instead of a turbo diesel or a large capacity petrol engine, instead there is a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder petrol engine up front, mated to an electric motor as well as a 9-speed automatic gearbox. That power goes to all 4 wheels via 11 selectable drive modes, and as a result, this is a car that should be able to offer the size, practicality, and efficiency that you'd expect from a modern car. Now, while the performance figures on this car are quite heady, so are the measurements. Because while this car certainly looks very large on camera, the reality of things tends to be a little bit more confusing. It might look like a vehicle that competes directly with the Land Cruiser because it looks like it, but actually this car is only slightly larger than a Toyota Land Cruiser Prado. As a result, it does mean that this car is slightly taller, slightly wider than what you'd see from, say, a Ford Everest, but on the whole, this is actually what you'd expect within the segment. However, the design of this car is what sets it apart. That very bluff front end, the very bluff rear end. This car is very bold and in-your-face design language means that this car takes up a lot more visual space than you might necessarily expect, which is why this car looks like it punches above its weight in terms of price. Now, in terms of the wheelbase, the Tank 500 actually shares an identical wheelbase with a Land Cruiser 400 series, which means that this is not exactly a small car. However, because that wheelbase has been stretched out, they have maximized the amount of room on the inside for passengers, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But perhaps this angle is the best view of the Tank 500 to me, because it really does show off this car's very brawny, very muscular nature, while still retaining all of the benefits of a body-on-frame construction when it comes to off-road capability. Design highlights on this car include a massive chrome grille up front, flanked by full LED headlights replete with automatic high beam. This car also runs on 20-inch alloy wheels running highway terrain tires in order to improve on-road performance. And at the rear, once again, you also get full LED taillights, although they've resisted the idea of putting in some sort of light bar. Instead, there is a huge amount of chrome stretching from one side to the other in order to make this car look very, very distinctive on the road. Now, in terms of the overall design, like I said, I do think the Tank 500 is quite bold, it is quite brash, and it is quite in your face, which is very, very different from some of the competitors that you get within this segment, although I suspect that that is a difference that a lot of customers will appreciate. They'll also appreciate things like, for example, the spare tire cover back here, because again, it does make this car look a lot more distinctive compared to vehicles like the Toyota Fortuner as well as the Ford Everest. What they might not be a fan of, however, is this massive swing door, because unlike other SUVs, GWM has opted to have a swing door with this car rather than one that pivots upwards, a more typical tailgate. Now, the reason for this is because of that spare tire. When you have a swing gate that goes upwards like that, it's impossible to mount a spare, so this is what they've had to do. However, this does present a small issue when it comes to trying to get clearance in the car park, but there we are. Now, one of the things about the Tank 500 that a lot of people might not notice is that this is actually a full 7-seater, and the third row can be raised via a set of buttons without too much issue whatsoever, provided that the second row has actually been provided a little bit more clearance. But in any case, with the third row up, you get about this much room, which is not much at all. But given the fact that most people within this segment use their cars as 5+2s or mostly 5-seaters, you should be able to access most of this space more often than not. Underneath this boot floor, you will find a tiny little bit of space, not really much to use anything. But overall, I do feel that this is a relatively practical vehicle for the money. At 330,000 ringgit, this is not exactly the most expensive vehicle within the segment. And in fact, it is sort of knocking on about the same price as a Ford Everest. Whereas compared to an Everest, instead of running a diesel powertrain, you have a turbocharged petrol powertrain here. And given the fact that this is an electrified powertrain, it ought to be a little bit more efficient in town, or at least in theory. The inside of the Tank 500 is a surprisingly upmarket place to be, because there has been a special emphasis placed on material quality and build quality within this cabin in order to appeal to a slightly more upmarket buyer. So for example, the upholstery on these seats and for most of the cabin is actually done up in Napa leather, which is lovely and soft with a nice grain to it. There is also lashings of fake wood throughout this interior in order to make the car again feel a little bit more premium, a little bit more upmarket. There is plenty of double stitching about the place on the door cards, on the dash top, and overall I can feel that, or I do feel rather, that on first impression this car does look like an upmarket premium place to be. And that's before you get onto the specifications themselves. So for example, up here there is a massive central touchscreen which controls the majority of this car's functionality. That is flanked by another digital screen to handle instrumentation. There is another screen up ahead to handle my heads-up display. All of these things display information to me in a manner that I want, although some GWM-like idiosyncrasies still exist here for better or worse. Moving further down, however, there are, mercifully, lots of physical buttons to handle things that you might want on a regular basis. Things like your HVAC controls, for example, live there. There is an analog clock, which is nice to see. There are more buttons here in order to control this car's various off-road functionalities, as well as shortcut keys for the ventilated seats, which are very important for this market. And the same goes for the steering wheel, where once again, they have resisted using capacitive touch buttons. Instead, there are nice big buttons here and nice big controls everywhere, because for GWM they feel that given that this car is a capable off-roader, should you want to manipulate any of this with gloves on, you need to have very large touch points. It is just unfortunate, however, that they figured out how to do that with the buttons, but then not for the user interface. Anyway, beyond that, this car also comes standard fit with an Infinity audio system comprising of some 12 or 14 speakers, which are pretty decent within this cabin. There's also an enormous panoramic sunroof, the front half of which can be open. There's lots of cubby holes, there's lots of places to hide stuff, a big glove box here, a relatively large center console bin which is air conditioned at that, couple of cup holders, decently sized door bins. Overall, this is a practical place to be, and because there is a huge focus on quality, it means that whatever it is that you touch feels relatively solid, relatively well built, nothing squeaks, nothing rattles, no matter how bad the road surface has gotten, and overall it does seem pretty impressive upon first glance. And then there's the second row. With the front seat set up in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have acres of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof. And even though this is a body-on-frame construction, I do still have a pretty good amount of space in the footwell in order to enjoy a pretty decent amount of under-thigh support, and I can still tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. But the space back here is only half of the story, because the amenities in the rear half of this cabin are extraordinary. For example, these two outer seats are ventilated. There is also a separate climate zone back here. There are crotch coolers should you want them, but there are also air conditioning vents up here on the ceiling. You get these blinds on the side, which is great if you have children back here in child seats that might be sensitive to UV rays. And I also have a huge amount of adjustment in the tilt angle of the backrest, which means that I can lean all the way back like this should I so want to, or I can sit bolt upright if I prefer that instead. And of course, on top of all of this, I still have a center armrest with cup holders. I have decently sized door bins. There are pockets in the backs of the seats. There are pockets up here. Overall, life back here is pretty good. And I would argue that this is perhaps the best specified body-on-frame SUV currently officially available in this country. And so all of this sets up the GWM Tank 500 to be a relatively impressive affair. The question now is, does this interior impression also extend into the driving impressions? Now, after having spent about 10 hours and 760 kilometers in the driver's seat of the GWM Tank 500, I think I can surmise the experience pretty alright. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this car is powered by a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine mated to an electric motor, beyond which sits the 9-speed automatic gearbox. Now, although this car is a hybrid and its build is an HEV, it doesn't actually work the same way the H6 HEV did. So while that car runs primarily on the electric motor with the 1.5-litre turbocharged engine in the H6 working predominantly as a generator, the Tank 500 operates more like a traditional, conventional hybrid system, where the electric motor and the relatively small 1.7-ish kilowatt-hour battery work mostly as support in order to provide a little bit extra torque, a little bit of extra twist when the car needs it. Now, from behind the wheel, this car feels like any conventional ICE vehicle for most of the time, because when you put your foot down, eventually the car will pick up and go. It is worth bearing in mind that this is a ladder frame construction. This is a big, heavy SUV weighing in at about 2.6 tons. And so a 2-litre 4-cylinder hauling a car like this along is not going to be the sprightliest of affairs. Instead, this car has a rather relaxed manner to it. So it gets up and goes in its own time. Don't try to rush it because there's genuinely no point. Now, the only time that the hybrid system sort of makes itself known is when you're driving at lower speed. So in town, for example, at speeds sort of below 30 kilometers an hour, this car is able to knock itself into full EV mode, which does remind me a lot of vehicles like the Toyota Corolla Cross Hybrid, for example. Like I said, this is a very conventional hybrid system. Now, because it uses that more conventional hybrid system, it feels pertinent for me to warn you that you need to temper your expectations. This car is not going to deliver the same jaw-dropping fuel economy figures that you saw from the H6 HEV or vehicles like it, like the Nissan Kicks, for example. Instead, this is just going to be about maybe up to 30% more efficient than a comparable internal combustion or pure internal combustion competitor. Now, that aside, the rest of this car, however, is pretty good. Again, bearing in mind that this is a 330,000 ringgit vehicle, hardly the most expensive thing in the world, but it does, of course, take the crown as the most expensive Chinese vehicle currently on sale in the country. Chinese SUV in the country, I believe. That said, this car does seem to at least offer initially the sort of positive first impressions that you'd expect. The interior build quality is all pretty good. It's quite refined, even at motorway speeds at 110, 120 kilometers an hour, despite the massive 20-inch alloys and the relatively bluff design to this car, wind and road noise is relatively well suppressed. These seats are also quite comfortable with lumbar support for the driver, as well as massage functionality for both front seats and ventilation for the first 2 rows of seats. All very good, all very positive. Now, of course, it remains to be seen whether or not this would do justice as a practical family car. I feel that the Tank 500 would appeal predominantly to the sort of people who like big, bulky SUVs but don't really need more than 5 seats, mostly because the third row in this car is relatively compromised, as is usually the case with body-on-frame construction SUVs like this. However, compared to vehicles like the Ford Everest, for example, I feel that the Everest drives with slightly better resolve. It feels like a slightly more sophisticated vehicle, but it is also a smaller car, which means that if you are looking for something that is slightly larger, slightly more practical, then this might be a worthy consideration. Also, the Ford Everest is only available in this country as a pure diesel offering, whereas if you want something that runs on petrol, then this is basically it. And of course, if you're comparing this like for like with something like a Land Cruiser 400, then obviously, this is the only one that offers a warranty. So would I recommend a Tank 500? I think we have to wait for the full review for me to do that. But I think that if you happen to be on the market and you're looking to spend this kind of money, I think the Tank 500 HEV is certainly worth a look. They are available at showrooms nationwide, and GWM's network is pretty extensive at this point. And I think that, again, if you're spending this kind of money, this is a sort of car you ought to at least consider. Mostly because if you don't, you might not know what you're missing out on. However, whether or not this is a worthy rival to a Land Cruiser, again, we'll just have to wait for the full review. In any case, that concludes our media drive of the GWM Tank 500 HEV. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care and stay safe.